All right, so everybody see the slide now?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
All right, very good. So wanted to talk to you about finishing process I've been using for about the last year. I have always used oil-based finishes in the past, and I've tried water-based a couple of times, but never came up with a combination that really worked for me. But lately, I've come up with something that I think works pretty well, and I'm finding the oil-based finishes are not as good as they used to be. They seem to be reducing the volatiles in them, and they don't work quite as well as they used to, and the water-based finishes are getting better. So for me anyway, I've hit a point where I think I'm switching over to water-based top coats. All right, so I've got a combination of products that work pretty well for me, and we'll talk about how to use them. First thing with using a water-based finish is that you need to enhance the color in the grain before applying the water-based finish. The water-based top coats do nothing generally for grain enhancement or color enhancement. If you don't have that before you put the finish on, you don't get it. So you want to do your color and grain enhancement before you put the water-based finish on. And this was a big step for me, is I tried wax-free shellac before applying the top coat. And the shellac does a nice job of sealing the wood and enhancing any color, or enhancing color and grain a little bit, so that when you put the water-based finish on, you don't have any issues with an interaction between your stain or oil-based grain enhancement and your water-based top coat. So shellac was an important find for me for that. And then finally, I had to find a water-based top coat that worked the way I wanted and was visually appealing. So I want to talk about the actual products I'm using. Okay, first for color and grain enhancement, I'm using Danish oil in a natural color. And I find that works really well on cherry especially, and sapele and some other woods for bringing out a nice warm color and enhancing the grain as well. And this is where I'm getting that grain enhancement you get for an oil-based finish. It's from the Danish oil. It's easy to apply. It's a wipe-on finish. You apply it, let it sit for a few minutes, apply it again, let it sit for a few more minutes, and then wipe it down. So it's easy to apply. There's no problem with dust or runs because you wipe it down when you're done. And I find it works really well for me. So the next thing is, okay, so I've got some color and grain enhancement. Now I want to seal it. And I'm using Seal Coat, Universal Sanding Sealer, the wax-free formula right out of the can. So this is where I'm getting my shellac from. It's certainly easy enough. You just buy it and apply it. So it does a great job of sealing the wood, so you don't have any interaction with your oil-based stains or finishes and that water-based top coat. It's compatible with just about any top coat made on the planet. And since I'm getting it here from Seal Coat, I use it right out of the can, so there's no issue with trying to mix it from flakes and getting the cut the way I want it and all that. I'm just using it straight out of the can. Very fast drying time. And cleanup is super easy. I don't actually clean the brushes I use for this. I have dedicated brushes in 2 or 3 different sizes for shellac. And shellac is permanently soluble in a denatured alcohol, which I show here on the right of the screen. So after I apply the shellac to a project, I just let the brush dry. And next time I want to use shellac again, I just put a little alcohol in a glass jar, put the brush in for 5 or 10 minutes, and it's ready to go. So super easy cleanup because I don't actually clean the brushes at all.
So what kind of brushes do you use for this, for the shellac?
I'm just using a kind of a standard brush you can pick up at your big box store that's meant for oil-based finishes.
Okay.
It's important that you don't use a foam brush. Foam brushes tend to be soluble in alcohol. So if you try to use a foam brush, it will melt. It does not really get you the results you had in mind. Also, one note about using shellac is that because it uses an alcohol solvent and you use alcohol with it, it is highly flammable when it's wet. So you do need to use it appropriately as far as appropriate ventilation and no sources of ignition. You'll note that the can here on the right of denatured alcohol is listed as fuel. So it does burn very readily. Okay, so now I've got my grain enhancement and my sealing, and I'm going to move on to my top coat. And what I've been using for a top coat that I found works really well for me is this EM Tech waterborne varnish. Now, something that's water-based and varnish to me doesn't make a lot of sense. So it's a water-based product that, you know, does something like varnish, but obviously it's not an oil-based varnish, but it works very well for me. I get this from Target Coating, and they have a website, and you can order various products of theirs. This is the one I've tried. If you are going to order from Target Coating, get on their mailing list for email. They send out discount codes very frequently. I don't think I've ever paid full price for anything I bought from them. So, all right. So what's good about this product? It brushes well and it sprays beautifully. There's no sanding between coats if you do the coats within 24 hours of one another. And that's something I really like. I never did like the sanding between coats of oil-based polyurethane. Has a long shelf life. Even after you open the can, it doesn't skin over. And of course, it cleans up with soap and water. So it's really easy to wash your brushes out or to clean out your spray equipment. Now, when applying it, I found that I needed to thin it 5 to 10% with distilled water to get good flow from it. And that's actually a recommendation from the manufacturer, and that did seem important. It comes in various sheens, gloss, semi-gloss, satin, and flat. If you're using anything but the gloss, you have to stir it to get the flattening agents into solution. And then after you stir it, you need to filter it, run it through a paint filter, because no matter how much you stir, there's still some lumps of that flattening agent floating around in there. And if you don't filter it, it's going to clog your spray gun. I initially started out and read that on the can and thought, well, gee, I've stirred it. I don't need to filter it. But as it turns out, you do. Otherwise, you end up taking your gun apart and cleaning it out and then filtering it and trying again. All right, so now let's talk about the finishing process. I have different finishing processes for different woods. Now this little jewelry box here is a figured black walnut and with maple on the corners and that little knob, and that top is actually the sapwood from that same piece of black walnut that the base is made out of. So when I was using this board, I saw the figure in that sapwood and thought, hey, that'd make a great top, and it turned out really well. So finishing for this part, for maple and black walnut, I just used the shellac and then the water-based varnish. So for this, I applied 2 coats of shellac, sanding between each coat with 400 grit paper to remove any runs and roughness and other issues I might have had. And then I applied, for this project, 3 coats of the water-based varnish, in this case with a spray gun. So the water-based finish is pretty forgiving, especially the satin. Whether you spray or brush it, it does pretty well at flattening, self-leveling, and is not terribly prone to runs. And like I said, there's no sanding required between coats, and on a good drying, under good drying conditions, you can recoat it in 2 hours. So you can do 2 or 3 coats in the same day quite easily. And I've had very good results with that. Okay, as I noted before, you do have to thin the water-based top coat at 5 to 10% to get the finish you want. And with any other finish I've ever used, and it's true with this one, to get the perfect looking finish in gloss is a lot trickier than it is in the satin or other flatter versions. So if you aren't super fond of the gloss look, make your life a little easier and use a satin or something like that. It'll be easier to get a really smooth looking finish.
So John, are you using an HVLP or are you using a regular gun?
I'm using an HVLP.
Okay.
And for the shellac, when I spray that, that's really easy to clean out the gun, dump the shellac out, wipe out the cup, put a little alcohol in it, swish it around, spray it through the gun. I dump out the little bit of alcohol and I do that again, and then the gun is clean. For the water-based finishes, they take a little more cleaning. So generally I pull the gun apart and then just run water through them in the sink. But since it's water, I can use gallons of it if I want to. I don't end up with a bunch of solvent that I don't know what to do with. So that works really well for me.
So do you use a compressed air to kind of blow out the gun with the water in it just to clean, dry it out fast?
So generally I put the gun back together when I'm done, and then just put it back on the HPL, just
Okay.
run it for a minute and dry. And then I leave it, to dry in parts. I don't leave it on the cup, but.
Oh, okay.
But that all seems to work pretty well. All right, so for cherry and sapele, I want to get some grain enhancement and some color enhancement. So for those, I apply the Danish oil as the first step. And just following the directions on the can. Danish oil does wonderful things for cherry. If you've never used it on cherry, you should give it a try. It really does nice things for the color and grain on the cherry, especially. So, apply the Danish oil following the directions of the can, wipe it down, then let it sit for 3 days before you try to do anything more. You want the Danish oil to fully cure. Then I applied 1 coat of shellac, either sprayed or brushed. And then depending on how successful I was, if I got a nice smooth finish on the shellac, then I'll just rub it down with fine abrasive pad. If I had runs, then I'll have to get out the 400 grit sandpaper and take those runs off. But once I've done that, I'm ready to apply a couple of coats of the water-based varnish, either brushed or sprayed. So one note on that, once you've got the shellac on there and you've done your sanding, I remove any dust with a damp rag, which is just water base. You don't want any oil-based finishes going on after you've got the shellac on there, or oil-based solvents that might interfere with the water-based top coat. So once I've got the shellac on there, then any wiping down I do with the product is just with water, with the project is just with water. Once again, you thin the finish at 5 to 10% and apply these particular boxes here, which the one on the left is cherry and black walnut, and the one on the right is sapele and black walnut. I use the satin version of the varnish on. So that was another little project. Those happen to be beads of courage boxes. I encourage all the members to participate in that. I find that's a worthy program to spend a little time on.
Hey, John, I got a quick question for you on those boxes.
Yep.
Okay, so in your first coat, you were talking about doing the Danish oil to kind of highlight the grain. Do you find you had to do any sanding afterward? You said wipe it on and leave it for about 3 days.
Okay, so you wipe on the Danish oil, 2 coats of it, just a few minutes apart, and then after you let it sit just a few minutes, you wipe it down so it's dry. So when you're done, you don't just apply it and let it dry like a paint or something. You let it soak in, and then you wipe off all the excess till the piece is as dry as you can get it. And at that point, it's very smooth. Then you want it to cure for 3 days before you go to any more steps.
Okay, so you didn't find you had to do any like 400 grit sanding or anything like that, right?
Not after the Danish oil, no. That leaves a very smooth finish.
That's great. That's great. Thank you, John. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Now you can use the Danish oil as the final coat. They actually sell it as the final coat of the product, but it doesn't provide a lot of protection for your product as far as water or other issues with use and abuse, shall we say. So I like to put additional finish on beyond the Danish oil.
Once the water-based finish has cured, like you could use this on a tabletop, you wouldn't have to worry about rings from glasses or anything like that, or is that not advised?
You could use it on the tabletop and that sort of thing. It's fairly tough, and it's definitely waterproof in the sense that, if you put a glass down, then it sweats, and then you pick it up half an hour later and wipe it down, it'll be fine. I certainly wouldn't put it on something I was going to submerge in water, but other than that, it'd be fine for tabletops, and the kind of water you get from a sweating glass or something will be fine. Once you just wipe it up and no issues.
Thanks.
Hey, John, when you do your final sanding, do you come back with water, raise the grain, and then sand again?
No, I don't. Because I'm using either the Danish oil and the shellac or just the shellac, I seal the product against the water-based finish. So I don't have any trouble with raising the grain once you have the shellac on there. So I do typically sand it or rub it down with an abrasive pad after I put the shellac on. That tends to give you a slightly raised grain, but it doesn't require extensive sanding to get rid of that.
Thank you.
All right. Moving on. All right, so red oak. So if you want the natural red oak look, I find that it works well if you use the same steps you do with the cherry, which is to say the Danish oil and the shellac. The Danish oil helps to warm up the oak some. The red oak is pretty flat if you don't put some oil on it and somehow. But I find the Danish oil does a nice job of warming up the red oak while still leaving you with what you would think of as a natural red oak finish. And then the shellac, and then the water-based finish on top of that. If you want a golden color to the oak, similar to the old hardwood floors that were finished with an oil-based varnish from 30 or 40 years ago, like the ones I have in my house, you need to stain the oak. That golden color came from that old oil-based varnish that you can't buy anymore. So I find that if I want to try to simulate that, I have to actually stain the oak with an oil-based stain. And for that, I'm using a golden pecan stain. You'd think you might use a golden oak stain, but any of the stains that are meant for oak tend to have very fine black particles in them to highlight the grain. And that's not the look I'm going for. I'm not trying to highlight the grain. I'm just trying to change the color tone of the wood. So to get that golden color, similar to the old varnishes, I'm using a golden pecan stain. And then from there, I apply a couple of coats of shellac and then the varnish on top of that, the water-based varnish, similar to how you do the maple. And finally, when the finish is complete and the water-based finish is dried, sometimes the piece feels a little rough to your fingertips. And that may be because I get overspray from finishing with the spray gun. I'm not sure, but it's easy to correct. I wait overnight for the coat of finish to dry, that final coat of finish, and then you just rub the piece down with craft paper. In other words, a brown paper bag. And it will smooth that up without creating any scratches in the finish. It works really well, and it's also applicable to other finishes, not just this particular water-based one I'm using.
One of our guests, Steve, had a question. I'll ask it for him.
All right.
He's used linseed oil and was thinking of comparing that, asking you to compare linseed oil with Danish oil.
Okay, so the linseed oil gives you a similar look. You definitely need to seal the linseed oil with the shellac. The Danish oil is pretty good at sealing the wood, and you can, if you put the water-based finish over the Danish oil, you don't get a lot of interaction between the Danish oil and the water-based finish, although you get some. So even though the manufacturer of this, target coating of this water-based varnish says you can put it directly over Danish oil, I find that you get some interaction between the Danish oil and the water-based finish. So the shellac is an important step in there. With linseed oil, it's really important. The linseed oil does not seal well against water at all. And if you put a water-based finish over linseed oil, you immediately see problems with the finish. So I find the Danish oil gives me a slightly more water-resistant middle step there before I put the shellac on.
This is Keith. I've also found that linseed oil takes months to dry. It just is terrible for drying.
John, does the shellac fill the grain on oak? I mean, lots of pores in the wood on oak. Usually to seal it, you need something mixed in with the shellac, fine sand or whatever they use,
Yes, so the shellac isn't going to seal, well, it's going to seal the wood, but it's not going to fill the pores. So if you want to have the pores filled for your oak, you need to use some sort of a pore filler on that.
Okay.
The shellac is much too thin a product to do any sort of filling of the pores.
Okay. So they call it a seal coat, but it's not a pore filling seal coat.
No, it is not a pore filler at all.
Okay.
It is a sealer. It will seal the product against interaction between different types of finish or interaction between the wood and your water-based finish, but it does not provide any pore filling.
Gotcha.
Or at least not appreciate, not so you notice.
Yes.
So Fred, your question about filling the pores on oak, that's a good question, and it's pretty hard to do. Walnut is similarly challenging when you want to do that. I found that the top coat using a thicker varathane or a thicker oil-based or water-based varnish can do that, but you do have to be careful about runs because you're obviously putting it on thick enough to fill the pores.
Okay.
John, if you could bring that last slide back up. You were showing to use a craft paper or brown paper bag to take any dust particles or fine roughness off. And I wanted to make a comment about that. I use essentially the identical steps that you were talking about, and I'm glad that you detailed the products and the methods very nicely in your PowerPoint. And I have John's files, and they'll be posted with today's meeting minutes in case anybody wants to go back and look at the exact details. In any case, I just recently finished a cherry wine box, and I, without knowing as much as you have known and experimented, I followed your steps accidentally. So I have to give you credit for teaching me through the space of, the through the force, Luke. In any case, at the end, I had the same roughness that you mentioned, and not knowing about paper bag, I used, I wet sanded with 1200 grit sandpaper, and I used oil varnish instead of water varnish, General Finishes. And and thinner as the liquid lubricant. And then I took it to my buffer Beal system, and I finished it up with carnauba wax. So I got a really nice luster over the top of a semi-gloss oil varnish. But the buffer works for me, and it produces a real nice feel on the hand as far as the result. But I'm going to try your paper bag because I'm about to start another project and do something similar.
I don't think you're going to get quite the same feel you get from buffing it with wax, but it is a lot easier, shall we say. You just rub it down and you're finished.
Yeah. Well, no, in between I use Tripoli and White Diamond on the buffer as well, and that takes care of it.
Okay, any other questions?
One quick comment. You were mentioning before about filling oak. Somebody mentioned about the pore fillers and such. When you're applying the Danish oil, if you get some 400 grit wet dry sandpaper and sand over the piece while the Danish oil is wet, that'll act as a nice pore filler for oak as well, and it doesn't alter the color at all.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay,
Great.
I
Great.
think we're done with John. Thank you very much.